Your history teacher lied to you about the 1973 oil crisis. Not intentionally, perhaps, but they left out the most explosive part of the story. Everyone remembers the textbook version. Arab countries got angry about Western support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War. They imposed an oil embargo. Gas prices spiked. Americans waited in long lines at pumps. Crisis ended. Life went back to normal. But that sanitized narrative misses the real story, the one that involves the largest wealth transfer in human history, secret deals that still shape geopolitics today, and financial flows that literally changed how the entire global economy operates. What happened in 1973 wasn't just about gas lines and thermostats. It was about $300 billion, over $1 trillion in today's money, changing hands in less than 2 years. It was about the birth of the petrodollar system. It was about power shifting from Western boardrooms to Middle Eastern palaces almost overnight. Stick around, because what I'm about to tell you will completely reframe how you understand the modern world. The real story begins years before 1973 with something called the Bretton Woods system. I know, sounds boring, but this is absolutely critical. In 1944, while World War II was still raging, the Allied powers gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to redesign the global financial system. They created an elegant arrangement. The US dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce, and every other currency would be pegged to the dollar. This made the dollar as good as gold, and the United States promised that anyone holding dollars could exchange them for actual gold anytime they wanted. For 25 years, this system worked beautifully. The United States became the undisputed financial center of the world. But then came the problem. America started printing far more dollars than it had gold to back them up, funding the Vietnam War, massive domestic spending programs, you name it. By the late 1960s, other countries started doing the math. They realized that if everyone tried to exchange their dollars for gold simultaneously, America couldn't possibly cover it. France's President Charles de Gaulle called America's bluff and actually started demanding gold for French dollars. Other countries followed suit. So on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon dropped a bombshell on national television. He announced that the United States was temporarily closing the gold window, meaning dollars could no longer be converted to gold. Everyone knew temporary was a lie. The Bretton Woods system, which had structured global finance for nearly 3 decades, was dead. Suddenly, every currency on Earth was just floating. They were worth only what people believed they were worth. No gold backing, no tangible anchor to reality. Now here's where it gets interesting. The oil-producing countries in the Middle East had been selling their oil for dollars, believing those dollars were as good as gold. They had accumulated billions of dollars in their treasuries, thinking they possessed real, permanent wealth. Overnight, they realized they'd been trading their finite, irreplaceable oil resources for paper whose value now depended entirely on faith in the US government. They felt cheated, and they were furious. Throughout 1972 and early 1973, OPEC countries held increasingly serious discussions about taking control of their resources. They had several grievances. First, oil was absurdly cheap, less than $3 per barrel in 1973. Think about that, $3 for 42 gallons of oil that could power cars, heat homes, run factories, and create plastics. Second, Western oil companies still controlled most of the production infrastructure and took most of the profits, paying relatively small royalties to host countries. Third, and this was the kicker, they were now being paid in devalued dollars that weren't backed by anything. The tension was building toward a breaking point. Most Americans had no idea this storm was coming. Then on October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel during Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. The fighting was intense, and Israel struggled initially, shocking everyone who remembered Israel's dominant performance in the 1967 Six-Day War. The United States immediately began airlifting billions of dollars worth of military equipment to Israel. The Soviet Union backed the Arab side. Every regional conflict during the Cold War became a proxy battle between superpowers. On October 17, 1973, just 11 days after the war began, the Arab members of OPEC made their move. They announced a 5% production cut, with more cuts coming monthly until their demands were met. More importantly, they declared a complete oil embargo against the United States and any country supporting Israel. But here's what most people miss. The embargo wasn't really about punishing the West or changing policy toward Israel. That was the public justification. The real goal was to drive oil prices through the roof to recoup the wealth they felt they'd lost when Nixon killed the gold standard. They wanted to fundamentally reset the financial relationship between oil producers and oil consumers. And they succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. Within months, oil prices quadrupled. Let me repeat that, quadrupled in a matter of months. A barrel that cost under $3 in early 1973 was selling for nearly $12 by early 1974. The images everyone remembers are the gas station lines in America, cars stretching for blocks, sometimes miles. Stations ran out of fuel and closed. Some places implemented odd-even rationing based on license plates. People got into fistfights. Some slept in their cars overnight to hold their place in line. But those gas lines were just the visible symptom. The real action was happening in the financial flows. Here's where the story becomes truly insane. Even though OPEC countries were producing less oil, they were making exponentially more money because prices had skyrocketed. Saudi Arabia's oil revenue jumped from about $4 billion in 1973 to over $30 billion in 1974. Kuwait, with less than 1 million people, was suddenly bringing in tens of billions annually. The UAE, Libya, Iraq, Iran, all experiencing the same wealth explosion. This wasn't just a lot of money in absolute terms. Relative to their small populations and economies, it was incomprehensible. They literally had more cash than they could spend domestically. So where did all those billions go? Back into Western banks and financial markets. They had to put it somewhere. This created what economists call petrodollars, dollars earned from petroleum sales that get recycled back into the global financial system. And this is where the story gets fascinating. The major Western banks, Citibank, Chase Manhattan, Bank of America, were suddenly flooded with deposits from Middle Eastern oil producers. But banks need to lend money out to make profits, so they started making massive loans to developing countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina borrowed heavily to fund development and cope with expensive oil. At the time, everyone seemed to be winning. Oil producers had money. Western banks were profiting. Developing countries got cheap loans. But this would come back to haunt everyone in the 1980s when those countries couldn't repay, triggering the Third World Debt Crisis. That catastrophe was a direct consequence of the financial flows set in motion by the 1973 crisis. Now here's something truly explosive that most people never learned. There's substantial evidence that parts of the US government weren't entirely upset about oil prices rising. I know that sounds insane given all the problems it caused, but consider this. Higher oil prices made US domestic production profitable and ensured that oil-producing countries would have mountains of dollars they needed to invest somewhere safe. And the safest place to invest dollars? US Treasury bonds and American financial markets. In the mid-1970s, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger held secret negotiations with Saudi Arabia. The details remain partially classified, but here's what we know. The US and Saudi Arabia made a deal. Saudi Arabia would continue pricing oil in dollars and invest a large portion of its oil revenues in US Treasury bonds. In exchange, America would provide military protection to Saudi Arabia and sell them advanced weapons. This became the foundation of the US-Saudi relationship that exists today. This deal was brilliant from America's perspective. Even though Americans were paying more for oil, those dollars flowed back to the US government through Treasury purchases, helping finance budget deficits. More importantly, it meant global oil trade would continue being denominated in dollars, creating permanent worldwide demand for the currency. Any country wanting to buy oil needed dollars, which gave the United States enormous leverage over the global economy. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. It was now backed by oil, or more precisely, by the fact that you need dollars to buy oil, and everybody needs oil. The impacts of 1973 are still reverberating today. The crisis completely changed how Western countries thought about energy security. It sparked massive investments in alternative energy, fuel efficiency, nuclear power, and domestic production. Japanese car companies gained huge market share with fuel-efficient vehicles, while Detroit kept making gas guzzlers nobody wanted. The environmental movement gained momentum as energy concerns aligned with ecological worries. France went almost entirely nuclear for electricity. America created the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and eventually lifted bans on domestic oil production. But perhaps most importantly, the crisis marked a fundamental power shift. Small countries that had been ignored by great powers became major players because they controlled critical resources. The petrodollar system established in the 1970s still structures global finance today. The crisis also triggered stagflation, simultaneous high inflation and recession, that traditional economic theory said was impossible. It brought down governments across the Western world and created the conditions for the Reagan-Thatcher conservative revolution of the 1980s. And when oil prices eventually crashed in 1986, it devastated the Soviet Union's economy, contributing to the end of the Cold War. So here's the bottom line. The 1973 oil crisis wasn't just about gas lines and OPEC flexing its muscles. It was about the death of the gold-backed dollar and the birth of the petrodollar. It was about $300 billion, over $1 trillion in today's money, transferring from oil consumers to oil producers in less than 2 years, then flowing back through banks, treasury bonds, and real estate in a completely restructured global financial system. It was about secret deals between America and Saudi Arabia that still shape geopolitics. It was about Western banks making catastrophic loans to developing countries that would trigger debt crises for decades. It was about technology shifts, political revolutions, and the transformation of the Middle East from a backwater to the center of global energy politics. The 1973 oil crisis changed everything about how the modern world works. And almost nobody knows the real story. Your history teacher didn't necessarily lie to you, but they definitely left out the most important parts.